Good evening. Welcome to the Church of the Redeemer. I'm David Ware, a member of the clergy team, and it's so great to welcome all of you here to this evening's episode of Voices. Tonight we welcome Scott Shane, who was a reporter in the Washington Bureau of the New York Times, where he wrote about national security and other topics. He was part of teams that won Pulitzer Prizes in 2017 for coverage of Russia's hacking and other projections of power abroad, and then in 2018 for reporting on Russian interference in the 2016 presidential election. From 1983 to 2004, he was a reporter for the Baltimore Sun, and he covered beats ranging from courts to medicine, writing articles on brain surgery, schizophrenia, drug corner, guns and crimes, and other topics. In season 5, episode 2 of The Wire, he played himself. So those of you who've come to engage him for that, your dreams have been answered. He'll speak tonight about his most recent book, Flee North, which tells the story of Thomas Smallwood, who bought his own freedom, led hundreds out of slavery, and coined the term Underground Railroad. So, Scott, welcome. So glad you're here.
Thank you. Thanks very much to everybody for coming. Everyone hear me okay? Okay. I'm going to talk about my book and mainly I'm going to introduce you to the three characters and to the big themes of the book, though I'll try to avoid telling you what happens. I'll try to avoid spoilers, and I hope you get a chance to read the book.
Can I invite you to go up to the lectern because we can't see you on the live stream?
Oh, sorry, okay. Yeah. How's this? Okay. I'm here. Sorry to be so distant, but it's for the video. I'll begin, before I start showing slides, I want to begin by just doing a little time travel. So I'll take you back to the summer of 1842 in Washington, D.C., in southeast Washington, down not too far from the Navy Yard, in the home of a physician named William Gunnell, who also enslaved a number of people. Among those he enslaved was a 5-year-old girl. And believe it or not, he gave the 5-year-old girl a full-time job, and her job was to stay up all night on the floor of their bedroom, and if their baby, if the parents' new baby started to stir, the 5-year-old's job was to rock the cradle and to quiet down the baby so that her enslavers would not be bothered. But anyway, her mother and father, the 5-year-old's mother and father, decided they'd had enough of slavery, and they'd heard about the two guys who were the good guys in my book, Thomas Smallwood and Charles Torrey, and they got in touch, and on a particular night, they were supposed to gather at a particular spot in Washington, along with a bunch of other people. A total of 15 men, women, and children had to slip out of the homes where they were enslaved and gather to get in a wagon and head north. But the difficult thing, as you can imagine, was for this mother to slip her 5-year-old daughter out of this bedroom without waking the baby, without waking the parents of the baby, and somehow she managed to do that, and they all gathered together. However, the liberators in this story, Smallwood and Torrey, had failed to procure a wagon and a team of horses, and they were still working on that. So they had to hide these 15 people in various attics and sheds and basements around Washington for 24 hours while they got a hold of the team of horses and the wagon, and the next night they took off. The middle of the night. However, of course, that morning, 3 or 4 families who had enslaved these 15 people woke up and found them missing. And Smallwood has a wonderful passage where he talks about there was no one to get the person's breakfast, there was no one to drive their wagon, there was no one to do any of the things they needed done. So this sets off a lot of chaos. And also, this was a huge financial loss. I did a rough calculation that in today's dollars, these 15 people might have been worth about $200,000. So you're talking about people losing a significant amount of their wealth overnight without a trace. So they naturally round up a posse of slave catchers and send them north in search of these folks, not knowing these folks have been delayed and they're still hanging around D.C. And the next night, they take off, and they're on their way north when somewhere near Baltimore, the axle on the getaway wagon breaks, and Charles Torrey happens to be driving this, and he's a Yale graduate who doesn't really know what he's doing, so but he manages to drive off into a grove of trees, and to try and work on the wagon, fix the broken axle. And just at that moment, this posse of slave catchers comes south and doesn't see them. So they're essentially, it's a very lucky break. And they continue on, and a few days later, Torrey writes to Smallwood, who's still in D.C., and says, we're in Troy, New York, and I'm putting the fugitives on canal boats to take them into Canada. And so that's basically what this book is about. But I'm going to begin with, because we're in Baltimore, I'm going to begin with the bad guy in this story. And the story of the domestic slave trade, which some of you may know about, but if you're like I was not too many years ago, and like most Americans, you won't really know what I mean by the domestic slave trade. So this is just a period map of the slave states and the free states, and that's just what I mean by slavery's borderland in the subtitle. A lot was going on around the border between Maryland and Pennsylvania in those days, which was really an extremely consequential thing if you were in slavery to get to Pennsylvania. But you were far from safe because that whole area was being patrolled by bounty hunters and kidnappers and slave catchers. So you had to go a whole lot farther to be safe. But what was interesting about the northern tier of the slave states, where we are now, is that all kinds of people were mixed up together. So if you were in New Orleans, you might well meet a slave trader, but you weren't going to meet an abolitionist. If you were in Boston, you might stumble across plenty of abolitionists, but you weren't going to meet a slave trader. Here in Baltimore and in Washington, these people who were, blood opponents who hated each other, were all present and fighting over the institution of slavery. And in addition, the number of, in the cities, the number of free African Americans actually exceeded the number of enslaved African Americans. So free people and enslaved people, often in the same family, in the same church congregation, were here. And so it made for a very, very interesting mixture. This just shows that, give you a rough idea that Maryland had almost 500,000 people, and the enslaved population of about 90,000 exceeded the free population of about 60,000. But in the cities, both Washington and Baltimore, as you see, the number of people who were free, the number of black people who were free, was about 3 times the number of people who were in slavery. So that, that really affected the politics, the atmosphere, and I think the situation of the enslaved in the cities. And you also can see there that Baltimore was the big city of that day. It was, in fact, in the 1840s, it was the second largest city after New York. It would be surpassed by Philadelphia in a decade or so. But at that point, it was the second largest city in the U.S. and much, much larger than Washington City, as it was known, which was really kind of a village plus the federal government, 23,000 people. So I'm going to start this story in Baltimore with the domestic slave trade. One reason the mother and father of that little 5-year-old in Southeast D.C. may have decided to flee is the domestic slave trade. They would have known that at any time, with no warning, their 5-year-old daughter and their other child, who was a little older, could have been grabbed and taken to the slave traders and sold south, away from them, never to be seen again. Or one or both of them could be sold south, and they would never see their children again. And particularly for parents, that was something that was on their minds all the time. So the domestic slave trade arose starting in 1808, which was after Congress had banned the international trade in human beings, the African trade. So you were no longer allowed, Americans were no longer allowed to import people from Africa to do their work. And it happened to coincide with the invention of the cotton gin and a huge boom in cotton production in the Deep South. So there was insatiable demand for labor in the Deep South, and nowhere to get that labor other than people were already enslaved, if you're talking about enslaved labor. And up in this area, tobacco had, of course, been the dominant crop. But tobacco wears out the soil after a while. So in the early 19th century, farmers in Maryland, Virginia had started to shift to other crops, mostly to grains. And grains require far fewer people to produce them than tobacco, which, like cotton, is a very labor-intensive crop. So there was a labor surplus in the Upper South, and in the very early years of the 19th century, you see a lot of Maryland slaveholders freeing their slaves, voluntarily manumitting their slaves because they just didn't want to feed them. It wasn't necessarily an act of charity, but if they didn't need their labor, they didn't want to feed them, they didn't want to house them. So then, after 1808, because of the difference in prices and demand for enslaved labor in the Deep South and in the Upper South, there was a big price differential, but there was also huge demand. So these people in Maryland who enslaved people whose services they no longer needed, realized that instead of just freeing somebody, they could contact a guy like Hope Slatter, whose offices were on the north side of Pratt, a couple of blocks west of the harbor, near Howard and Pratt. They could contact a guy like Slatter, and they could say, I'll sell you these 3 people and get a lot of money. And Slatter would ship them south to New Orleans, where his brother ran his showroom, believe it or not, they called it that, in New Orleans, and they'd be sold for $300, $400, $500 more. So it was a very lucrative business, and these middlemen, including Hope Slatter, became quite wealthy. So Slatter was the leading slave trader in Baltimore from about, he arrived in Baltimore in the mid-1830s, and he dominated the trade from the late 1830s to the late 1840s. And he was from Georgia, and in fact, a lot of traders were from Georgia. Sometimes they referred to as Georgia men. And he had started as a small town sheriff, and as a sheriff, he had to oversee estate sales, and often those estates in Georgia included human beings. So he got familiar with the process of buying and selling people, and he then went into the slave trading business. At first operated in southern towns in Fayetteville and Charleston from hotels, and then by the mid-1830s he thought he was ready for the big time, and the big time was Baltimore. Baltimore, Richmond, Alexandria, those were the dominant northern ports, or upper south ports in the domestic slave trade. So he moved to Baltimore, and in 1837 he built and opened a new slave jail, a private slave jail on Pratt Street. This document that you see here is a manifest of one of his ships that he was sending south. Because the federal government wanted to make sure that a boatload of African American or African workers arriving in New Orleans did not originate in Africa, which would have been illegal, they required that a manifest be written up with the full name and other details of everybody who was being shipped south. So now they're actually very valuable documents for family genealogy, that kind of thing. But he had to sign one of these manifests every time he shipped another 60, 80, 100 people south. This was the ad, one of the ads that he ran daily in the Baltimore Sun. And this is from 1838, and he's bragging about his new slave jail, big brick building on Pratt Street, where he would accumulate people in literally barred cells, separate quarter for men and women, a courtyard in the middle, and he'd accumulate them until he had a shipload that he could send south. And here he describes it in very flowery terms as the finest establishment of its kind in the United States. He makes it sound kind of like a spa or fancy hotel until he gets to the part where he's talking about he's always ready to buy Negroes. Cash for Negroes is what the ad said. So this is just a period map of Baltimore showing the harbor, which was then known, the inner harbor was known as the Basin in those days. And you can see Slatter's slave jail, which is right on the number one, I guess, just north and west of the harbor. This, actually, believe it or not, the Maryland Center for Culture and History still has a collection of daguerreotypes shot in the 1840s. These are from 1845, so that's what the harbor looked like in 1845, and that's Baltimore Street in 1845. Just give you a feeling for the place. And this is Hope Slatter's slave jail, where thousands and thousands of people pass through on their way to a terrible fate, in most cases being separated from their families in the process. And of course, this is a situation where they don't know where they're going, their families don't know where they're going, and most of these separations were forever. Anyway, this, as you can see, Slatter's jail was a very substantial building. This picture was taken in 1910, long after it was no longer used as a slave jail, but it gives you a sense of it. It was later torn down. It gives you a sense of how sort of formidable his business was. This is an illustration from an anti-slavery book that shows a man being separated from his family. We know very little about the domestic slave trade, but at the time, Americans knew everything about the domestic slave trade. The abolitionists used it as one of their strongest arguments for the criminality and the inhumanity of the institution of slavery. So they highlighted it constantly, and anyone who was in slavery knew all about it because people their friends, their neighbors, their relatives were constantly being grabbed and sold south. So this man is being separated from his wife and their baby and apparently their other children. And at right you can see that white woman in the bonnet who appears to be the slaveholder, and this sort of sleazy looking guy in the top hat with the striped pants is the slave trader who's there to take him away. And this is also an anti-slavery poster playing on the slave trade in Washington, D.C. So in addition to operating around the Inner Harbor in Baltimore, slave traders operated in Washington, including the biggest one operated right next to the National Mall. You couldn't walk from the White House to the Capitol in those days without passing this slave traders operation. And here you have again the slave traders in their top hats with their whips, and up in the corner a reminder with the picture of the Capitol and the flag that this is supposedly a land of liberty, which was a point the abolitionists often made. And there's the ship that's waiting to take these people to the south. So that is sort of the background. And that is really what people were running away from, to a degree that I did not appreciate when I started working on this book. Now we come to the much more inspiring characters in this story. And so Thomas Smallwood, who ends up, who I'd never heard of when I began my research and ended up being the central character in my book, is a really extraordinary guy who I think every American should know about. I think he really deserves a place alongside people like Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman in the pantheon of great anti-slavery Americans. So he was born into slavery in Bladensburg, Maryland, right outside D.C. in 1801, and he happened to be inherited, along with his sister, by a woman who married a man named John Ferguson, who happened to be, if not an abolitionist, at least fairly hostile to the institution of slavery. And so when Thomas was 15, this guy John Ferguson, his enslaver, took Thomas to the courthouse in Upper Marlboro, PG County, Prince George's County, and filled out a manumission paper in which he said, you're now 15, at the age of 30, I'm going to free you. And what it doesn't say there is he also said, because he had to buy Thomas for $500 from his new wife and her children from a previous marriage, he asked Thomas to pay that money back. So between the age of 15 and the age of 30, Thomas was hired out in various jobs and was able to put some of his earnings towards the $500. And by the age of 30, he was free. And he and John Ferguson remained on good terms. They were neighbors, and he seems to have thought a lot of him, in part because John Ferguson and his wife taught Thomas to read. And subsequently, Thomas was hired out and was a household servant in the house of a Washington educator by the name of John McLeod. And this guy McLeod, according to Smallwood, greatly encouraged him in his self-education. Smallwood never went to school for a day in his life, but he managed to get very well educated, and as his writings would show later on. He seems to have read everything. He's constantly quoting philosophers and poets. And he says that McLeod and McLeod's adult children all gave him books to read and encouraged him in his learning. So by the time he's 30, he is living down in southeast D.C. This is a painting of D.C. In that period. The giant white buildings down by the water are the Navy Yard, which is still there, and what we call the Anacostia River's coming down from the right side, the Potomac River's coming down from the left side. In those days, the Anacostia was called the eastern branch of the Potomac. Up on the hill, Capitol Hill in the middle is the U.S. Capitol. And way off to the left is the President's house, later known as the White House. And this is just another overhead showing the two rivers. And Smallwood's house was on 4th Street Southeast, and Ferguson lived a couple, I think 3 blocks away, and they were very near the Navy Yard. And Smallwood had started a business as a shoemaker, and he was sometimes called Smallwood of the Yard, of the Navy Yard, in other words. That was sort of his neighborhood and his area of operation. And so he married a free black woman named Elizabeth Anderson from Virginia. They had 4 kids and a 5th one on the way. This is in the early 1840s. And he's sort of building a life for himself in freedom. This is just the Capitol before it got its the dome we know, which actually didn't come till 1863. And so Smallwood, not surprisingly, having experienced slavery and having any number of neighbors who had experienced the true horrors of slavery. There were women from Bladensburg who, a couple of famous examples of women from his little town of Bladensburg, who were sold south and loaded into the slave trader's wagon, and one of them slit her throat on the way to the slave trader's jail. Another one was locked up above a tavern on F Street and jumped out the window in despair and broke her back, and later said she was sorry she jumped out, not because she broke her back, but because when she was indisposed, they took her children and sold them south, and she would never see them again. So he had seen a lot of that, and he was very preoccupied with the problem of slavery. And one of the movements at that time in the 1820s and 30s that was very prominent and the subject of a lot of discussion and debate was colonization. As some of you know, it was the idea was that black folks will never get a break in this country. This is sort of the origin of it. And so they really should make a clean break with the U.S. and start lives somewhere else. And quite a number of free black people left the U.S. and settled in the Caribbean, West Africa, and other places. And so it was a phenomenon. But it really took off and became institutionalized under something called the American Colonization Society. And they started a colony called Liberia in West Africa. This is the capital, Monrovia, named for James Monroe. And Smallwood became very interested in the colonization movement. He had some friends who had moved to Liberia, and for a number of years he was quite intrigued by it. And then, like actually many other African Americans, especially in Baltimore, Washington, word got around as to who was behind this movement. And as Smallwood learned, the real kind of money men and the powers behind it were slaveholders. And as he later wrote in a memoir, he came to realize that the purpose of the American Colonization Society was not to, essentially give black people a new start. It was to get free black people out of the United States, essentially to make the United States safe for slavery. Because, as he says here, the feeling was on the part of the organizers, some of the organizers and funders of the American colonization movement, the idea was that free black people, particularly in states like Maryland, where free black people were so numerous, they were undermining, essentially, the slave system, infecting, as I think he writes there, the enslaved with a spirit of freedom. So he broke quite violently with that movement. He talked to all his friends, he spoke publicly, and he tried to combat that movement. So that's where he was in the very beginning of the 1840s. he's got his life together. He's taken this interest in politics. He's broken with the colonization movement, but he's still very interested in the problem of slavery and what to do about it. And about that time, this guy shows up. So Charles Torrey is about the opposite, but in many ways, of Thomas Smallwood. He's white. He's born not into a lot of money, but his parents died of tuberculosis when Charles was very young. But he's raised by his grandparents, and his grandfather is a quite well-known public figure in Massachusetts. He grows up outside Boston, and his grandfather has served in Congress. And he's sent to Exeter and then to Yale. So unlike Smallwood, who never went to school, Torrey kind of has the best education money could buy at the time. He finishes Yale at the age of 20, very religious, but a little uncertain what he wants to do with his life. He decides to try his hand at teaching, but it doesn't go terribly well. I think he starts a little school outside Boston, and I think he starts with 5 pupils and gets up to 20, and by the time he's writing this in his journals, he kept voluminous journals, often berating himself, as he is here, for basically being broke. The number of pupils has gone back down to 5. He has no money and no prospects. So after trying his hand at teaching, he abandons that and decides to become a preacher. And he does some study. He marries the daughter of one of his mentors, and they have a couple kids. But apparently he did not do much better at preaching than he had done at teaching. I found a parishioner who wrote that Torrey gave a terrible sermon, and he's still very young. He's in his early 20s. But the other thing is he gets very distracted by the anti-slavery movement. He's very caught up in the anti-slavery movement, which at that time was, the center of Massachusetts politics in many ways. And so he parts ways. He serves as a minister in 2 churches, but eventually he parts ways and is putting all his time into the anti-slavery movement. And he actually has a big battle against the leading abolitionist in the United States, who you've probably heard of, William Lloyd Garrison. He's the dominant figure in abolitionism in the 1830s. In 1839, Torrey and some of Torrey's allies try to oust him, essentially try a coup d'etat, because Garrison, while he was very courageous and very energetic and charismatic, he had a somewhat peculiar idea that the government and the political system of the United States was so corrupted by slavery that you could not use them to battle slavery. So he didn't think you could use politics to fight slavery, and in fact, for that very reason, he refused to vote. So Torrey and his allies thought that was nuts, and so they tried to oust him. They failed. The Massachusetts abolition movement split in 2, and Torrey and his allies started their own newspaper and their own society, and so this is a little excerpt from a letter that Torrey sent to one of his mentors and allies in the anti-slavery movement, Amos Phelps. And as you see, he calls William Lloyd Garrison's famous abolitionist newspaper, The Liberator, the lying berater. And he referred to William Lloyd Garrison as William Lloyd Garrulous. So it was nasty. It was some nasty infighting in the abolition movement. But Torrey had another problem, which was he still wasn't earning a living, and he had a wife and 2 kids, and a father-in-law who was not terribly happy about the son-in-law. So he comes up with another idea, and the idea for yet another profession. and the profession is one that I spent 40 years of my life in journalism. So he decides he's going to go around to a lot of small abolitionist papers in the North, and he'll offer to be their Washington correspondent. So he'll send them the latest doings in Congress and the White House, and amazingly it works. He rounds up a bunch of clients, and he comes down to DC at the end of 1841. And right after he arrives, he's part of the idea is he wanted to see the slave South. So there he is in Washington. He's seeing people in slavery. He's seeing the slaveholders. He's seeing the slave traders. He's seeing coffles. C-O-F-F-L-E was the word for 50, 80 people chained together being marched somewhere. The alternative to being put on a ship and taken to New Orleans by sea was to be chained in one of these coffles and marched hundreds of miles south, usually by two slave traders who would have usually a rifle and be on horseback, and they'd be at the front and back of the coffle. Anyway, you could see these coffles crossing Washington, D.C. on a regular basis. So he was seeing all this, taking it all in, and he sees that there's going to be a convention of slaveholders in January of 1842 in Annapolis, in the capital of Maryland. And he thinks, this is great. This is going to be my first big story. I'll go down to this convention of slaveholders. It was the first time Maryland slaveholders had done anything like this. And I will, take notes and send my dispatches to the papers up north, and it'll be great. Anyway, he shows up, and the slaveholders at their convention are apparently a little sensitive about publicity, so they throw out the reporters who have gathered there. But instead of leaving, Torrey goes upstairs to the gallery and keeps taking notes. And so they spot him up there, and some people recognize him as a troublemaking, known card-carrying abolitionist. So they kick him out, and he's on the streets. And Maryland was not a hospitable place for abolitionists in those days. So he's soon surrounded by a mob that is basically discussing whether to lynch him or just tar and feather him. And a friendly magistrate comes to the rescue and locks him up in the Annapolis jail. So his life is saved. They can't find anything to charge him with, so they let him go after a couple days. But while he's locked up, he meets two black families who are locked up with him. And he talks to them, and he learns that they are part of an estate sale. They're sort of locked up in a dispute over the estate of somebody who's just died. And in all likelihood, they're going to be sold to the slave traders and shipped south. So he learns about that whole phenomenon, and he learns it firsthand. And so he writes all this up. It does make great stories for his newspapers in the North, and it's also written up by the local press in Washington and Annapolis. Basically this crazy abolitionist who showed up at the slaveholders convention got himself locked up. But Torrey is very full of himself, I guess you could say, and here he talks about his pledge made in the Annapolis jail that he would, not rest until he had obliterated slavery, eliminated slavery from the land, which are big words for a 28-year-old guy. But that was his feeling. So the next thing that happens, which is a kind of unremarked at the time, but for my purposes quite momentous meeting between these two guys. So Smallwood's wife Elizabeth had a laundry business, and she did the laundry, among others, for Mrs. Paget's boarding house. And Charles Torrey was living in Mrs. Paget's boarding house on 13th Street. And, even members of Congress tended to live in these boarding houses. And there was another boarding house called Mrs. Spriggs, where most of the radical abolitionists lived, and the members of Congress who were on the sort of most radical fringe of the abolitionist movement. And in 1847, some years later, an Illinois congressman named Abraham Lincoln would move into Mrs. Spriggs. But Torrey was living not far away at Mrs. Paget's, and because Thomas Smallwood had read about this crazy white man who'd come down and gotten himself locked up, and he wanted to meet him, and he'd heard from his wife that she'd met him. So he asked her to arrange a meeting. The two of them meet in January of 1842. So they start talking. They're talking across a chasm of race, obviously, of age, because Smallwood's about 12 or 13 years older than Torrey, of formal education, although I think probably Smallwood could have matched Torrey in terms of his knowledge of literature, his erudition. But they're united by one thing that I think proved to be very important. Torrey had done a lot of talking about slavery and the endless arguments over abolitionism in the North. And Smallwood had done a lot of talking in the endless arguments over the colonization movement in Washington. And so I think they were both kind of tired of talking about slavery, and they wanted to do something practical. So they come up with a quite audacious scheme, which is they want to start organizing escapes, and they're not going to do it in ones and twos, they're going to do it by the wagon load. Pack 10, 15, 18, 20 people into a wagon, men, women, and children, cover them with a tarp, maybe put a couple hay bales or something on to disguise it, and take off for the north in the middle of the night. And their hope is not just to accomplish the very concrete victory of moving, dozens, scores of people north to freedom. And Smallwood in particular always urged people to keep going till they got to Canada. That would be reward enough. But they also had a strategy in mind to go with these tactics, and that was to demoralize the slaveholders. So they thought that by basically waving a magic wand and making 3, 4, 5, 6 people owned by a local slaveholder disappear overnight. And these would be people whose, you can multiply the dollars back then by 30 or 35 to get today's dollars. So, these people were probably valued at somewhere between $500 and $1,000. So if you're talking about potentially tens of thousands of dollars of value disappearing overnight. So their hope was to just undercut the belief in the system on the part of the slaveholders. And Torrey in particular talked in very grandiose terms about toppling the entire institution of slavery. And that may have been a bit ambitious, but Smallwood talks about overhearing people whose, as he liked to put it, whose walking property had walked off, saying they were never going to buy another slave, that they couldn't afford to buy somebody and have them run off. So they would only hire people from here on out. So that was the idea. That's what they set out to do. So I have to see what this slide is. Okay. So you start to see in the Washington papers and the Baltimore papers runaway ads that are basically a testimony to the work of Torrey and Smallwood. Torrey helps out for about 6 months and then moves north to become the editor of a paper in Albany that was one of his client papers. So he leaves Smallwood on his own. Smallwood keeps organizing these wagon loads and sending them north, sometimes driving them north, sometimes getting someone else to drive them. And he recruits people to help him, particularly a man named Jacob Gibbs in Baltimore was his Baltimore guy. Gibbs was a house painter and whitewasher, and he later moved to New York and became a fairly significant figure in the Underground Railroad in New York City, kind of receiving people on their way north. But here he was Smallwood's kind of right-hand man in Baltimore, and he often appears to have organized a safe house where people could stay. So Smallwood talks about sending people the first night to a safe house in the vicinity of Baltimore. Second night, they would get as far as the Susquehanna River, and the third night, they would get into Pennsylvania. And for the most part, they'd go to Philadelphia, and if they could raise the money, they would try and just basically take steamships and trains on the way north through New York up to Albany and on into Canada, often by canal boat. So anyway, you begin to see these runaway ads where they're offering $50, $100 as a reward for returning somebody who's run off. And this is the paper that Torrey would go work for. But by the time he had moved up to become the editor, Smallwood had already started something quite remarkable on his own. So you think about Thomas Smallwood, and this is why he came to be the central character in this book and really a kind of fascinating guy. He is working as a shoemaker and trying to support a family of 5 children, which cannot have been easy. But meantime, he's organizing these escapes, which often means coordinating with several enslaved households. People were enslaved in several households in different locations. You can't text people. He had to communicate in person. He had the opportunity to, as a shoemaker, as a guy who was active in church, he could always find some excuse. He could meet people at the market. He could meet them, on the street. He could go look them up, and they could pretend they're talking about a new pair of shoes. But he had to do a lot of this coordinating work. He had to meet people at night. He had to send off these wagons. He had to hire the wagons and the horses. So it's an enormously demanding task that he's given himself, and extremely dangerous. If he were caught doing this, the best he could hope for would be a long prison term. It's completely possible he'd be shot, just gunned down at the site of one of these escapes. And it's also possible that if he were arrested, part of his punishment would be to be returned to slavery and sold south and separated from his own family. So the stakes are extremely high. You'd think he has enough going on, but he decides he wants to write about these escapes for this newspaper, Tocsin of Liberty. And so every couple of weeks, and I don't know when, I picture him in his little house on 4th Street Southeast with a candle, scratching away and drafting these dispatches for this newspaper, Tocsin of Liberty. Tocsin's an old word meaning bell or alarm bell. So he sent these off every couple of weeks, and he was very influenced by Charles Dickens. Dickens had a huge bestseller at the time called The Pickwick Papers, and so Thomas Smallwood always in these dispatches used the real names of the slaveholders and the real names of the people who were fleeing the slaveholders, but he couldn't use his own real name, so he borrowed a pseudonym from the Pickwick Papers, from Dickens' Pickwick Papers. He called himself Samuel Weller Jr., Sam Weller, and he started to send off these dispatches. He talks here about two-legged samples of humanity. What's he call it? Two-legged property turned into humanity. So he often is playing on the remarkable transformation of people who were property and suddenly turn out to be free human beings. And the purpose of these columns is basically to mock the slaveholders and to celebrate the people who are escaping from them. And he's very good at it. And I think his style, as well as his pseudonym, owes something to Charles Dickens, because a lot of these are actually very funny. Some of them are scathing, Some of them are kind of ferociously angry, but quite often he has a good time mocking these guys. And this is just one of the ads. Often he'll reprint an ad, a runaway ad, and then he will riff on it essentially. And here's his sort of commentary on that ad. And he's talking about another ad here where he says, Mr. George Gardner of Charles County, Maryland, has advertised for somebody who's run off. And he says in this ad, the slaveholder says in this ad, Henry, who calls himself Henry Edelin. And this is a significant point. In these ads, the slaveholders often suggest or want to argue that the enslaved don't have last names. They only have first names because they're sort of a second order of being, and they don't deserve last names. But the enslaved did have last names, which they used. But if you're an enslaver and you want to get these people back, you kind of have to put in the last name because maybe it'll be helpful. So they would often say Henry, who calls himself Henry Edelin, and that always sets off Smallwood, who says, pray, Mr. Gardner, what would you have him call himself? And talks about how this system is essentially designed to strip people of their humanity. But he does this with great style, and he eventually writes off about 20 of these dispatches to the Albany paper. Here's just a place where he's been, there's a big guessing game that's going on among Washington and Baltimore and county slaveholders around here as to who's writing these letters. Because one thing Smallwood asks the paper in Albany to do, the editors in Albany to do, is to make sure they send a copy of the paper to any slaveholder who's named in one of his columns. So these guys, first their enslaved workforce disappears, and then a couple weeks later they get something in the mail from Albany, and they open it up, and there they are being mocked by name. So it's pretty pointed stuff. So there's this guessing game going on, and not surprisingly, someone has guessed that Charles Torrey must be this guy who's writing these missives, and Smallwood affects great indignation and says, no, absolutely not. He says something like, how can you confuse me, whose name is known around the world, with an obscure abolitionist like Torrey? And he says, I, Samuel Weller Jr., will continue to scoff at, annoy, and expose the slaveholders and their crooked ways to their perfect mystification and great pain during weeks and months to come, the poor ignoramuses, to think to catch such a weasel as I, asleep. Now, that gives you a sample of what this guy's up to, and I should just make one more philosophical point about what Smallwood is doing here. In the 1830s, as the abolition movement took hold, and as the slaveholders were being beaten up every day in northern newspapers by northern politicians, there was a shift in the defense of slavery. The defense of slavery, if you think about a guy like Thomas Jefferson, had been sort of shamefaced, sort of a necessary evil. So Jefferson talked about the slaveholders being in the position of holding a wolf by its ears. You can't let it go, you can't hold on. But they knew it was wrong. George Washington knew it was wrong. And they weren't so forthright in their defenses. But as the abolitionists attacked, and this may sound familiar from our own time, things were so polarized that the slaveholders began to mount arguments that the slave system was not a necessary evil, but a positive good, and in fact was the best organization of society ever. And the reason they gave was that these Africans and their descendants were incapable of looking after themselves and their affairs. So the slaveholders were actually doing them a big favor by giving them, work and housing and food and so on. So it was actually kind of an act of charity and a very noble thing for the slaveholders to do. So Smallwood is turning this completely upside down, and he portrays the slaveholders as a sort of dim-witted group of people who are incapable of looking after their own affairs. They don't seem to be able to drive their own carriages. They don't seem to be able to cook for themselves. They don't seem to be able to make their own clothes or wash their own clothes. It's hard to say what they do all day. Meanwhile, he always portrays the enslaved, and especially those who are escaping, who he's helping to escape, as extremely clever and easily able to outwit these kind of dim-witted slaveholders and get away. The other last point I'll make about these letters is, I found these newspapers. Tocsin of Liberty and its successor title was called the Albany Weekly Patriot, was a pretty obscure paper. And I found that the largest run seemed to be at the Boston Public Library, but this is 2020 and the pandemic's on and the Boston Public Library is locked up tight. And so it took me months of sort of haranguing the Boston Library. Eventually they helped me out and they microfilmed the whole run of the Albany newspaper. And I went there when they reopened the library, with masks and on a sort of small scale, and downloaded all these microfilmed images onto a thumb drive and brought it home to Baltimore and read all these columns of Smallwood's. And I was reading along, and all of a sudden I see the phrase Underground Railroad, but in a context that he doesn't seem to be using it the way we do. He says, he's mocking a slaveholder, and he says to him, as usual, he's addressing him by name, and he says, geez, maybe your slave disappeared by Underground Railroad or steam balloon, as one of your constables was swearing about the other day. And later on he elaborates, and there was a Baltimore police constable by the name of John Zell, Z-E-L-L, who was quite notorious. He had his own private detective agency. He's a police constable, and he makes most of his money as a slave catcher. So he was apparently overheard expressing frustration at all the people who were escaping slavery, undoubtedly many of them with Smallwood's help, and he's expressing bewilderment as to how they're disappearing. He can't figure it out, so he says they must be getting away by Underground Railroad or steam balloon. Those are basically non-existent technologies, so he's basically saying they must have been kidnapped by aliens. I don't know how these people are getting away. So anyway, to Smallwood, who's apparently somebody told him that John Zell, this notorious police constable and slave catcher, had been overheard saying this. And Smallwood loves the idea of this Underground Railroad because it's yet another way to mock the slaveholders who are bewildered by the fact that their unpaid workforce is slipping away and they don't know how it's happening. So he starts riffing on this term, the Underground Railroad, and using it in these dispatches. And some months later, he's appointed himself general agent of all the branches of the National Underground Railroad, Steam Packet, Canal, and Footed Company. So he has a grand time with this concept of an underground railroad. And when I made this discovery, I naturally went to Wikipedia to read about where did this phrase Underground Railroad come from, and it turned out it was pretty easy to determine that there wasn't really an explanation. There were a couple of folklore explanations, but they didn't really hold up to scrutiny. So historians had not really found the origin, And then I went into the big 19th century newspaper databases that are all digitized these days. And I put in the phrase Underground Railroad. And sure enough, all the early uses of Underground Railroad are from Thomas Smallwood's columns. So he's the guy who named the Underground Railroad. And finally, I'll wrap this up. I just want to share with you a sort of insight that took me months of research to come to, but became sort of the foundation thematically for this book. These are interviews with a guy went up in the 1850s, interviewed a bunch of people who had fled slavery and ended up in Canada. And he interviewed them about their lives, and many of them say, as these two do, the fear of being sold south had more to do in inducing me to leave than any other thing. Master used to say if we didn't suit him, he would put us in his pocket, meaning he'd cash us in. He'd turn us into, $600, $700, $800 cash. And the slave traders were eager to give him the cash. He would sell us. So that was the term used. I'll put you in my pocket by the slaveholder. And the other man, George Ross, says, he left because he was in fear of being separated from his wife and children. So Smallwood remarks on the same thing. He talks about it anytime he would have people hidden around Washington who had come to him because they got wind they might be sold south. And he would hide them until we could get a wagon together and they could take off. So the final point I'll leave you with, this is sort of a map that's in the frontispiece of the book. And I just wanted to put these two phenomena on one page. And it's sort of about the existential predicament of people who were enslaved in this region. If you were enslaved here at this time, you knew you could be grabbed by the slave traders, sold to the slave traders, and shipped south at any time. And you wouldn't necessarily have any warning. Somebody you've never seen before could show up, clap you in irons, throw you in a wagon, cart you away, without time to say goodbye even to your wife, to your child, to your sister, to your brother. You may not know that for decades after the Civil War, African Americans placed ads in American newspapers with headers, classified ads, saying things like, "Help me find my mother." And they were trying to stitch together the families that had been torn apart by the domestic slave trade. But for the enslaved who were highly aware of this, because they would know people, they would know their neighbors, their friends, often their relatives who had been sold south, so this was no mystery to them. But they also would know that unlike people who were enslaved in Georgia or Alabama or Louisiana, they weren't that far from Pennsylvania. And they had a decent chance of making it. They probably also knew people or knew of people who had escaped and never come back. So those two things would be coexisting in their minds all the time. And if they got wind that there was a guy, a DC shoemaker with a house painter friend in Baltimore who might know a thing or two about getting away, that might be the deciding factor. So thank you for your patience. I will stop talking, and if you have any questions or comments, I'd love to hear them.
We just have time really for a question or two,
Okay.
and I'm hoping when you're done, you'll answer questions at the table.
Absolutely, yeah. I'll be out there. There's a nice fellow from the Ivy Bookshop selling books. If anyone wants to buy one, I'd be happy to sign them and also just talk further.
It sounded like the story sort of took shape as you did the research, and I'm wondering what the original book that you were thinking that you was about to write was.
Yeah, that's a great question. So, we moved to Baltimore in 1983. I took a job at the Baltimore Sun as a reporter, and as you remember, as many of you remember, that was when Harbor Place was new and was sort of like an exciting thing, and we had little kids, so we spent a lot of very nice weekend afternoons wandering around the harbor, pushing strollers and buying ice cream and looking at the boats and things. And so I had very positive associations with the harbor. And somewhere in the 90s, I stumbled across, I think in an old book at the Pratt, the fact that there had been slave traders operating at the harbor for much of the 19th century, basically from about 1810 to the Civil War. And as I read a little more about that and understood the nature of family separation and these slave jails and all the other horrors that were associated with it, it really blew me away. And I started pestering the editors to let me write something about it. And I did write a long story in 1999 about the slave trade in Baltimore, but I wanted to return to it because I found it was just such a tragic story and such an important part of the crime of slavery. And I also found that very few Americans, black or white, really knew much about it. So anyway, I had that idea when I left the New York Times at the end of 2019. Unfortunately, the pandemic came along right about that time. But and I looked for a story initially within the confines of the domestic slave trade, but those being sold south were almost all illiterate. The slave traders were hardly literary and didn't leave much behind. So I was a little stymied, and then I started broadening the field, and that's how I came across Torrey. And the people who wrote about Torrey sometimes mentioned a black sidekick named Thomas Smallwood. And I started reading up on Smallwood, and I soon realized that it was very much the other way around. That Torrey was very much Smallwood's sidekick, and he was the driving force in this operation. And then when I discovered Smallwood's writings to the newspaper, just completely nailed the story. And for plot reasons I will not reveal, their paths cross. So I didn't have to leave the domestic slave trade out of the story. And then, and also I came to understand that the Underground Railroad was really driven by the domestic slave trade, by fear of being sold south. So that's how the book came together. Thanks for asking. Maybe one more? Anyone?
Short question, short answer.
Yeah. Well,
please give us an estimate of the number of slaves who were
sold?
freed.
We're free. Okay. Well, so I'll give you an estimate of both phenomena, and this will be the last point I'll make. So, very, very rough estimate is that about 1 million African Americans in slavery were forced south between about 1810 and the Civil War. About 1 million. So it's one of the largest forced migrations in history. And about three quarters of those were with the services of these slave traders. The estimates of those who escaped successfully via the Underground Railroad, or just escaped slavery successfully. Many people, of course, were caught and returned. Many who were caught were sold south. But a very rough estimate that scholars sometimes use is 100,000 who actually made it to the north or to Canada and never were dragged back south by the slave catchers. So the last point I'll make is that, so if those numbers are anything like correct, the domestic slave trade is about 10 times larger than the Underground Railroad, at least the successful Underground Railroad. Yet we know a whole lot more about the Underground Railroad. It's the subject of books and movies, and it's taught in elementary school. Then we know about the domestic slave trade. In my experience, most Americans don't really know what you mean when you say the domestic slave trade. They don't have any idea of its nature or its scale. And if you ask yourself why that is, I think it's because in the Underground Railroad, there is a role for warm-hearted white people, good-hearted white people who are helping people escape. In the domestic slave trade, there was no role for warm-hearted white people. And so I think the Underground Railroad became a kinder, gentler way for Americans, white and black, but especially white, to talk about the horrors and the crime of slavery. And I think that's why you don't hear much about the domestic slave trade. So on that happy thought, I'll be in back. Thanks again for coming.